Some folks are probably trickling in from their break. It was a very short break. As you know, with any great symposium, of course, we built some buffer time and we're always not on point with schedule. But with that being said, we wanted to make sure that we can get started with the additional speakers and content for the day. I am excited to welcome one of my co-chairs for the subcommittee, for International Subcommittee for the Symposium, Dulce Dorado. So, welcome. She's going to be kicking off our first session in regards to who are our international students. As many folks know, Dulce Dorado is the Director of International Students and Programs Office. So, and her office is represented here. Shout out to ISPO, where are you all at? So, with that being said, I know Dulce is going to be setting up with a presentation. After that, we have a great speaker to join us as well. So with that being said, I will pass it off to Dulce. Please give a round of applause.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Andrew, and good morning, everyone. And just like everyone else, I wanted to also welcome you to the symposium, and thank you all for attending. So my name is Dulce Dorado, and I serve as the Director of the International Students and Programs Office. It's been a very busy year, like for many of you, and I hope that this is an opportunity for us to engage in conversation and to learn a little bit more about our international student population. Our international students come from very diverse backgrounds and countries and locations, but I wanted to start off first with just how do we define them? So I'm often asked, how many international students do we have at UC San Diego? And I always pause before answering, because are you asking me from an admissions perspective? Are you asking me from a tuition purpose perspective or from a visa perspective? And as you can see here, if you looked at the admissions page, an international applicant is defined as someone who's not a US citizen or not a US permanent resident. And in terms of if you're looking at non-resident for tuition purposes, on our registrar's website, it says that non-resident students are those who come from outside of the United States to attend a US campus or a UC campus. And you can see that on this slide here, if you, some of this might look familiar to you. It's on the information center. And you can see the differences here in trying to figure out how are we defining our international population. So in the upper left-hand corner, when you look at California residency, you'll see that there's a California resident, a non-resident international, non-resident domestic, residency unknown. So you'll see here that 19.5% of the students are non-resident international. However, if you look to the right under ethnicity, race and ethnicity, there is a section there called international, and in that location, it says 21.3% of our students are international. So again, it depends on how you're defining it and who are we talking about. For our purposes, at least in the International Students and Programs Office, we're the visa office, so of course we're going to use a visa definition. And we use, on the basis of the Institute of International Education, who administers the Open Doors Report. It's a report that catalogs and collects information about the number of international students, the international faculty and scholars, and the number of students who study abroad. So we're basing that on students that are here in the United States pursuing a degree and are on a temporary visa that allows for academic study. So for ISPO, for the International Students and Programs Office, we're the office that issues many of the documents that students will need to apply for an F1 or a J1 visa to arrive in the United States. So this is how we also define, and it's in alignment with this Open Doors report definition, where there are individuals that are enrolled in coursework here at UC San Diego and are sponsored on a non-immigrant visa category. Well, what does that mean? So in general, it's students that are not US citizens, they're not asylee seekers, they're not permanent residents, they're not amnesty seekers or refugees or undocumented students. So that's how we've categorized them. So the data that I'm going to show to you is based on that definition. But I can't talk about the international student, the APIMED students, without first talking broader sense of who are our international students more broadly. So what this chart shows you is over a 10-year period, you'll see that the total number of international students served by the university has grown tremendously since 2012 and 2011. Some of you might remember back then when I remember working here at UCSD at that time, and I believe there were less than 2,000 international students. So it's grown tremendously, and as you can see, between 2012 and 2016, the population of our students grew by over 20% each year. And that was really seen at the undergraduate level, especially at the first year level of students. Prior to this, most of the international students at UC San Diego were graduate students pursuing PhDs, and this was also in alignment with the national trend. You'll also notice here that no surprise that in fall of 2020, that's I'll call it the anomaly year where there was a decline in our student population, but it's no surprise given the global pandemic, but also coupled with many of the visa restrictions and regulations, economic downturn, financial hardship for some of our students. So now we're seeing a little bit more of again, it's stabilizing again, hopefully for the next upcoming years. What this shows you then is as of, in comparing fall of 20 to fall of 2021 of our new international students, you can see here in the graph on your left, the blue line represents 2021 so for fall, and then the orange line represents fall of 20. As you can see, there were more new international students at that time, or in fall, and you're probably wondering, well, why is that, and what's the difference? There's really, I'll call it maybe two reasons. One is, of course, the improvement in the health and safety around the world, but most of these are actually graduate students at the master's level that deferred their admission during the pandemic and then are now coming back, and that's where you see the growth. And then on the right side is the total population. And what I should say too is when I define that our total population that we serve not only students that are enrolled in bachelor's, master's, and PhD programs, but our international students are also here on short-term programs and exchanges. They might be here for 1 quarter, they might be here for an entire year, but they're usually on an exchange program where they're registered in their home country and then doing what I'd call like a study abroad program here at UC San Diego. But we also have international students that are in our Global Leadership Institute at Global Policy and Strategy. We have international students in Health Sciences International. We have international students in Extension in our English language programs. So you can see our international student population are not just degree-seeking students, but they're also non-degree students that are here for a shorter period of time. Now, before I get to diving in a little bit about what composes our international student population and what parts are Asian, Pacific Islander, and Middle Eastern descent, I wanted to just show this slide about national trends. You'll see here that the leading places of origin for international students as of fall 2020 and 2021, more than 53% of the international students in the United States came from 2 countries, China and India. And there are nearly 1 million international students in the United States, and more than 50% come from 2 countries. And if you look at the top 20, which is the smaller, the table on the left, about 73% of the top 20 places of origin are actually in the Asia Pacific and the Middle Eastern region. Now, what does that look like for UC San Diego? And what you'll see is those trends are similar, and you'll see that with all of our peer institutions and Research One institutions as well. So at UC San Diego, this is what it looks like. 73% of the international students at UC San Diego come from 2 countries, China and India. And then of the top 20, I've highlighted here on my right, in blue, are similar to the top 20 nationally. And 89% of our students in the top 20 list come from the Asia, Pacific, and the Middle Eastern region. So the majority of our international students here at UC San Diego are what we would call APIMED descent students. And that's why I'm very excited about having this conversation and sharing information and to continue this conversation, because you can see that their lived experiences, where they're from, it's very diverse. Although these are the top 20 countries, our international students come from 112 different countries. So it's a diversity of location, diversity of language, just like what Provost Yang mentioned. Within India, he showed you the map of, there's hundreds of different languages within one country. Same thing in many parts of the world. So our students come from those diverse locations. Just to share what our students are studying, and for those of you that might be from those departments, you can see that our undergraduate students are predominantly, yes, in the STEM fields. But econ is the #1 major for our international undergraduate students, then followed by math, computer science, and then you'll see on the graduate side, there are a lot of students in computer science, also at the Rady School of Management with finance and business analytics, and of course the Jacobs School of Engineering. The last piece that I wanted to share about our students is their funding source. This is important because I think the main, I guess, perception of our international students is that they're either high on the socioeconomic list or that they might be, well off. It's true that international students have to show, before we can issue them their immigration documents, they have to show that they can pay for at least one full academic year, both the tuition and non-resident tuition. So they have to show that in a bank statement. But what you'll see is this, yes, some of them are from personal funds, but there are students who have families that pool their money together in order to meet that minimum so that we can issue their visa documents. You have students that are also sponsored by their home government, or they might be sponsored by an international organization. And these are scholarships that they are eligible for or that are earned. So that way, a lot of the countries might be trying to diversify and to support the socioeconomic development of their country. So this slide here shows that yes, 85% of the international students at UC San Diego, whether they're at the first year level transfer or the grad level, are sponsored by personal or family funds. So again, this is their own funds or their family or pooling of money together by family members. And then the other, 12% is U.S. college or university. So this is most likely our graduate students that are sponsored by departments. And the other remaining, as I mentioned, are home government or employer or a U.S. international organization. So I just wanted to show this information so that you understand, too, the diversity of our international students, what their lived experiences, you can infer, might look like. And again, it shapes how they view the world, how they engage on our campus, how we engage with them, and how we can continue to enhance their experience here at UC San Diego. And that's all I have, so thank you very much. So I know Sarab Aziz will be coming up to introduce our next speaker.
Good morning, everyone. Please excuse my nervousness this morning. I have never done that before, but APIMED is very close to my heart and on campus because it makes me feel I belong. As a staff member, as a U.S. citizen who comes from Syria originally. So it is my honor to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Jenny Lee, who is a professor at the Center for the Study of Higher Education and College of Education, Dean's Fellow for Internationalization at the University of Arizona. Oops, sorry about that. I'm looking for the photo. I promise I took it just a minute ago. Here you go. Professor Lee's research examines how migration policies, geopolitics, and social forces shape inequities in higher education in the US and abroad. Professor Lee has investigated university internationalization and partnerships, student and scholar mobility, and scientific collaboration, to name some. Based on her comparative research in the US, Southern Africa, and East Asia, she has introduced widely cited critical frameworks such as Neo-Racism and Neo-Nationalism to the field. In addition, Dr. Lee's expertise is regularly sought by national and international news outlets, NPR, Nature, Science, the New York Times, ABC News, Al Jazeera, and the Chronicle of Higher Education are among the prominent news networks that have quoted Professor Lee and featured her research. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Jenny Lee.
Thanks, everyone. I appreciate this opportunity. Just give me, a moment while I just plug this in. I was telling the organizers earlier that this is such a treat for me because I have the opportunity to visit my hometown where I grew up in San Diego. So on behalf of my mother, she thanks you that her daughter is coming to visit her. So there's something about going back to your home, and for those of you who haven't grown up here, and maybe you know what it's like to go visit your home for the holidays, and your parents, that introduction, they don't know who that is. I'm the teenage girl that didn't make her bed in the morning, and so this is getting me, and coming back to San Diego, especially these past few days, and walking around my neighborhood in Poway, by the way, and growing up where I grew up, led me to kind of think about my place here and coming back here and some of the stored memories here. Sometimes going back to one's home conjures up almost a time machine, a capsule of the past, where oftentimes those stories are locked away, and we tend to avoid and not want to go back, and then we do go back, and it's as if nothing has ever changed. So I was in San Diego back in the 70s, where Convoy Street had like 2 Korean markets and fewer freeways than now, and just to see so much positive change, and really this expansion of the ISPO community has been amazing to witness. But for someone who's been in San Diego for so long, or a former San Diegan, there are still stories that are still within me as I think about this place. And I wanted to share some of that with you to set some of the broader context for my talk. So, whether you're in student affairs, student support, academic affairs, international student services, or programming, we all know that, let's be real, it's not a science. It's not like we can say these are the truths that we must all do, and by no means do I claim to be an authority on how to solve all of these issues. But I think it's important to also think about our own experiences, whether you are an international student, whether you know of an international student, even if you've traveled abroad or you yourself are an immigrant. That also helps us connect with these students and ways that we can identify. Because we can spend the next 2 days talking cognitively about all these theories. Of course, I'll introduce theories, but we can talk about it on some intellectual level as if they are these the international students, are just this distant, faraway sample. But rather, how can we think of them as an extension of us? And oftentimes what will drive us to actually do something beyond our job description is that emotional connection, whether it be pain or fear or a positive experience. And that also will shape our worldview and how we think about the challenges for our internationals here at UCSD. So I'll tell you a little bit about my story, because I think that will also help you, hopefully help you think about your own and reflect upon yours in the next couple days, but also to understand my framing and why I view the field the way that I do. So my mother was born in what is now known as North Korea. Her family escaped upon the brink of the war and left behind a lot of possessions, extended family, friends, what they knew, and they came down to the South. Luckily, my grandfather had a little shipping business where they were able to escape by ship and make their way down to the southern tip of Korea. My uncle served as a translator for the US Marines. He came from a poor farming background, but really enjoyed learning the English language, was then allowed to serve and support the US Marines during that time. That then paved the way for immigration for my family. He was then supported, got a scholarship to go pursue eventually a college degree at Ohio State. He married my aunt, which then led the pathway for our own family to immigrate. Fast forward many decades later, this is of my mom, me, and my brother at Disneyland. We had become citizens by then, and we were celebrating, and in many ways, our story is very reflective of the American dream, that immigrant story from utter poverty, war, and coming to a place where we can now go to this amazing place called Disneyland. And yet I think there are questions that often are not told when many of us are held up as either poster children or examples of that ISPO success story, of that immigrant who came from nothing and has come to this amazing country, and look at us now, right? And from rags to middle-class riches. But I think there's also the story that's not being told. So my father had a degree in engineering, and he had a very limited English. So despite that degree, he busted tables down over in a little cafe in Rancho Bernardo. There was a lot of discrimination. He was eventually let go, but thankfully my parents had the opportunity to work in a factory over in Kearny Mesa, of course doesn't exist anymore, for minimum wage, and at the time was like $2 or $3 an hour. And that's really all my family had. So there was also a time when they were just a group of the factory workers were suddenly let go. And so they had come together, filed a lawsuit with the little resources they had, which then finally allowed my family to open up a deli. It's down over on, no longer there, but on University Avenue on Hillcrest, and it was known as Sam's Deli. So if you think about how ridiculous it is for a Korean immigrant family to be running a Jewish deli with 10 different kinds of cheese, when we're all lactose intolerant, right? It's like, but again, we made it work. We hustled and was able to even make a little bit more money than before. I was in middle school at the time. This then led to, we closed that shop down. We just couldn't make those pastrami sandwiches to Americans' liking. And so we opened up what many, I know this almost sounds like a cliche, but a Korean-owned dry cleaning business over in Mira Mesa. And that then allowed my parents to save even more and eventually have the house that we now have. But during that time, sorry, this was, can you, no, I know you can't see that. Tech support? Thanks. Thank you. So at the time, though, he was exposed to a lot of chemicals. I mean, you all know, back then we didn't know, but dry cleaning, you're exposed to a lot of toxins and things to clean people's dirty clothing. Well, eventually he had lung cancer and some liver cancer. There was followed by a botched surgery, and he died unexpectedly at the age of 58. So sometimes it is hard for me to kind of pass through that hospital where he passed away. and of course was really difficult on our family. This is the other side of our story to get to where we are now that is oftentimes not told. The hardships, the discrimination, the challenges for an immigrant family. And I will say that my story is not special. It's not even unique. But as an example, and I encourage each of you also to tap into your own immigrant story or your parents or your grandparents or the generation before, to hopefully better connect with what it is like to be an immigrant here, but also to challenge some of the structures that make it so difficult for one to finally make their way. So I'm going to talk more broadly now about some of the broader challenges. I think it's oftentimes when we go to these conferences, these national conferences, ACPA, NASPA, NAFSA, whatever conference you go to, oftentimes we talk about and frame international students or college students within the bubble of higher education, as if nothing is happening on outside the world, and the university has full control to be able to shape and protect our students. Well, we know that there's a bigger world, bigger things are happening, and I think especially when we talk about internationals, it helps to think about what are some of the broader patterns, the broader trends that are shaping what brings them here, but also what they experience once they arrive. And then why these groups in particular? Why APIMED? Why are we focusing on them? Dulce was talking about, they do constitute a majority of this international student population, as well as on most campuses. But why is this happening now? Why is the interest now? And I'm going to frame it within some frameworks related to neo-racism, neo-nationalism, territory. We'll have a little graduate student seminar, share a little bit about these concepts, and then hopefully talk about where do we go from here these next couple days. So as Serap was talking about earlier, coming from Syria, I mean, we know that internationalization oftentimes is not pretty. It's not safe. It's not always one just seeking a better opportunity for oneself just because it's a little better. Some are forced out, right? There is a lack of safety. There are challenges such as depicted here with refugees coming through the Mediterranean from northern Africa, from the Middle East, especially within Europe, has really experienced a huge influx of refugees from Syria and Afghanistan and parts within that region. Of course, even now, we still don't know the future of Ukraine with the ongoing war and the forced displacement of the Ukrainian people. But even very close to home, our own detention centers, also in Tucson, where I'm coming from. And what do we see here is another way of thinking about internationalization and migration that often isn't talked about. It's either too painful or too uncomfortable, and it's beyond our control. But it is worth looking at because it also helps to understand the perceptions of those who are then taking in these immigrants. And oftentimes, they're forced out but are not always welcomed. They are often seen as so-called foreigners or as strangers, and even worse stereotypes. And yet understanding that oftentimes that some of our international students may be coming into the United States for the different kinds of reasons that we may be familiar with. I also want to talk about what's happening here in the United States. I mean, none of this is a secret, but I think it's important to acknowledge as we talk about the APIMED population, the context for those APIMED internationals as well as our domestic students. And so the latest statistics show that 1 in 5 Asian American Pacific Islanders have experienced a hate incident in the past year. I mean, so either if you have not directly, you may know of someone who has. For example, Tucson is not considered a very big or densely populated location, but even a very good friend of mine was, someone had attempted to run her over by a car. She was sent to the emergency room, surgeries and so on, and the police person had said that, well, this was the same car of someone who had done this to another Asian American woman like hours before. And I mean, just never imagining that this would be happening so close to home. Overall, hate crimes have gone down, but especially towards those of Muslim descent, that has increased by over 500%. So again, we may think about an overall sense of safety, but when it comes to these particular populations, this is another reason for us to especially be watchful. Since the 2016 election, this is during Trump's campaign, there's also been rising attacks on mosques. In my own research, I'll talk about in a little bit later, also finding that among Chinese scientists, 1 out of every 2 are afraid of being surveilled by the FBI. And these are just some of the many examples about the increasing anti-Asian and anti-Middle Eastern hate that is occurring currently in the United States. Of course, much of this is not happening on our exact campuses, but helps to understand, what these students are feeling once they leave La Jolla, or once they cross Gilman Drive, or when they enter the United States. These are some broader patterns to, of course, be aware of. But the last square on the bottom left is that this is not just because it is, it's just the way it is. It really is also a reflection of US policies and laws that have contributed to the discrimination that they have been encountering and continue to encounter. So, probably this is not something you expected to hear about, but again, given this is my work, but to kind of connect what we're going to be talking about these next 2 days to these broader, larger political conversations that directly impact our internationals. Many of you can probably remember Trump's ban against those from Muslim-majority countries, restricting those to enter the United States, but also affecting our own internationals. There was a case that made headlines of a Palestinian student from Lebanon who had come to the border to pursue his continuous study at Harvard and then was stopped because the Border Patrol had decided to pull this person over, to go through their computer, open their Facebook account, and notice that his friends had made criticisms about the Trump administration and about the US government. This student, by the way, did not like or comment, just happened to be friends with, and as a result was denied and sent back home. These are the kinds of fears that international students undergo, even upon entering the United States. Am I going to be taken to that little room? And how, will they send me back? And how can I afford to make my way back and come back? And how will this affect my studies? That stress begins, upon obtaining a visa, for those of you who may have experienced, is challenging enough. But even once you get that visa and that letter from the university, even entering can be a tremendous source of stress and anxiety. Trump has made numerous attempts to limit Chinese students coming into the United States. I would like to say a lot of this has changed since the Biden administration, but has not. We still have SB 1070. Basically, if a Chinese student has any past history with the Chinese military, they are not allowed. There are many cases of Chinese graduate students who were forced to stop their studies and are still trying to make their way back. This is still in existence. And also for those in sensitive fields, Chinese students that are studying robotics, artificial intelligence, particular fields that may be considered especially sensitive, they need to renew their visas every year. Prior to that, it was every several years. Again, for those of you who know what it's like to getting a visa, it not only is it very expensive, it's also very unpredictable, and again, can be quite delayed. The work that I've been doing has also been looking at the China Initiative. So this was an initiative by the Department of Justice to say, hey, look at China. They are rising so much. They're actually outpacing the United States when it comes to the scientific output when you compare those countries. China's actually ahead of the United States. And so the federal government, and under Trump, and still has continued until very recently, is, well, why is this happening? It must be because these Chinese scientists are stealing from us. There's no other possible explanation, but that they must be taking all of our intellectual security and using it against us. And as a result, there has been particular, I would say, microscope or a particular attention that was paid to those of Chinese descent, including Chinese Americans, ways that they have been surveilled, ways that they have been removed from their grants, that they have been investigated. These, if you haven't followed, there's been major headlines like An Ming-hu, Gang Chen, Franklin Tao, and others who who failed to disclose the right paperwork. They were afraid. They didn't say everything that the FBI wanted to hear. They were sent, and these cases, of course, were dropped or they were exonerated, but nevertheless had stoked considerable fear in the Chinese scientific community. This has also affected our graduate students. Another example is not just from our previous and current leaders, but also from the FBI. There was recently a report that was released that showed the ways that the FBI had been engaging in racial profiling, with some examples that I'll share with you in a bit. So all of this to say that these are the kinds of rhetoric, the kind of assumptions, the stereotypes that feed into a particular narrative about the APIMED population as being dangerous and perpetual foreigners. So whether someone is a Chinese American, Indian American, wherever you might be, and maybe you're multiple generations removed from that first generation, oftentimes you may still be asked, what country are you from, right? This idea that we are perpetual foreigners, regardless of your citizenship, regardless of your passport, even regardless of your birth certificate, but also combined with a stereotype that we are dangerous, whether we are terrorists, whether we are spies, that we are coming here for malicious intent. And again, a lot of this does come from our own federal policies and the rhetoric of our leaders. These are just some of the ways that Trump has justified the Muslim majority ban. It's not about religion, it's about security. We can't allow people to come into this country who have horrible thoughts on their mind. There's an unbelievable hatred of us, referring to those from Muslim-majority countries, again, entire countries. We can't allow them coming in. They have this hatred of the United States, of people who are not Muslim. But this is an example not just of our former president, but even of FBI counterterrorism training materials. This is within the handbook to train FBI agents in thinking about who to target and the assumptions to feed into their actions. I think in many ways helps to explain the lack of due process, but what reasons why some people may be sought after and others left alone. Islam is inherently violent. Muslims and Arabs are intrinsically different from other Americans. They should be treated with suspicion. Religious practices and political activism by Muslim and Arabs are signs of increasing danger. Also within the FBI counterterrorism training materials, there was also things about Asians. You don't want to make eye contact with them. You don't want to shake their hands. Again, a lot of just sweeping views is part of that training. Of course, we're all familiar with the more recent rhetoric attributing the current pandemic and the coronavirus to those of Chinese descent, stereotypes associated with hygiene, with lack of cleanliness, irresponsibility, and even sabotaging our efforts, and by somehow having this undermined intention to cause a global pandemic with terms such as this. And related to the China initiative that I talked about earlier, the FBI had referred to those of Chinese descent, of professors and students, they're coming to take advantage and exploiting the very open research and development environment in the United States. So these are just some, and these are painful, but I think it's also important to recognize that these are what our students see on the news. They hear this from our leaders, that they see this iterated over and over in the media. But of course, this is also feeding into the American public and how this is also some of the assumptions coming in about these populations as they're entering our country. Of course, less is done to dismantle these stereotypes. Those of you who know a little bit more about immigration know that immigrants are essential to job growth, the overall economy. They create jobs. And they pay taxes. They actually do pay back the benefits they receive and then some. Dismantling the stereotypes about Muslims. US Muslims give more to charity than other groups. They actually give 33% more towards civil rights causes than other Americans. And yes, they're generous, but it also underlies their faith. So this is in direct contrast to the rhetoric about their faith that fuels violent extremism. But actually, it's the exact opposite, in fueling generous charitable giving towards social causes. And actually, the biggest terrorist threat are from white nationalists. When it comes to the Dulce had mentioned, just the importance of the international student population. And this is also goes hand in hand with our decline in domestic students. So there's been increasing concerns among colleges and universities throughout the United States that US high school graduates are less interested in going to college, that there's questions about college. They would rather go and get jobs, be a social influencer, I don't know. But regardless, the demand is declining, which then puts universities in a very difficult situation of how are we going to maintain our enrollments. And the US is becoming increasingly reliant on international students to maintain their operating budgets, but also in order to maintain our scientific competitiveness. In some of our graduate fields, international students comprise 50% or more. And there's long been a challenge with how do we get our domestic students to pursue STEM fields. And in the meantime, our international students have been making up for that. And so when it comes to scientific production, in a recent study, my colleague and I found that the US is actually more dependent on China than China dependent on the United States. And there's some references in the end if you want to learn more. But what I'm trying to say here is that we have these very horrible hate crimes occurring that are largely being fueled by assumptions, stereotypes, some of it even coming from our political leaders. And yet when you actually look at the research, we find that this is largely untrue. And that this is not just situational. It's not just in the current times. The US has a long history of scapegoating immigrants. This is what politicians do. When there's an economic downturn, when there's a recession, when there are challenges happening at home, it's throughout history we've seen over and over again, you blame the foreigner, you blame the immigrant. They are taking away what is rightfully ours. And of course, more recently, it's been China post 9/11. We're blaming those from the Middle East, and again, and throughout history. But not just in the United States. We see this throughout the world. The ways that immigrants have been the scapegoats in times of challenging domestic situations. If I was to sum up everything, the fundamental delusion of humanity is to suppose that I am here and you are out there. That somehow, as in humanity, that we are somehow separate, and that we are actually not aligned, that we don't have anything in common, that we are different. And I'll go into more of that in a bit. What frames my broader work is a recent book, U.S. Power in International Higher Education, and our next speaker, Christina Yao has contributed to this, but it's also this assumption about U.S. superiority. Of course, we do have the best universities in the world, as reflected in our global rankings. We have high-quality programs where we still are a great place of opportunity, especially for those in places of the world that don't have good higher education systems. But also along with that comes a sense of ways that we may be dominant and ways that make it especially difficult to appreciate and to work alongside our internationals. We are quite advantaged in that we speak the English language. For most of us, it's probably our first language, if not our second. Even though the English language is not the most commonly spoken language in the world, it's still the lingua franca of globalization. The US dominates in global rankings. We attract the most students across the world. We lead in international partnerships, but we also dictate those partnerships. We set accreditation criteria of the standards that other universities throughout the world must meet, and even determining, what is the curriculum and what it should look like. These are all the underlying ways that, especially within the US, that we have incredible privilege, but also an important responsibility when we work with internationals, that with the power, of course, comes a sense of responsibility, and how do we engage with those abroad? The world is certainly not equal, it's vastly unfair, but also how do we recognize the power that we have within our own country, especially when working with those with less power. So let's go hone down a little bit more and talk about the challenges for international students. I mean, I think if we were to go around this room, you can name them all. I'm just going to go over some of the broader categories of the challenges. And especially when we want to distinguish internationals from the domestic APIMED population, of course, language is the #1 issue, especially, of course, from China, from East Asia, but even foreign accents. I haven't looked into UCSD, but there are some universities that actually offer foreign accent reduction training. And so that basically means that if you have an Asian accent, they will work with you to kind of change that accent. But if you have a British accent or South African accent, that's okay. There used to be, it's been kind of on the down low at my university, but for example, a Brazilian student of mine went and said, you know, I really want to get rid of my accent, because some of you may know that if you have, depending on your accent, you may have worse teaching evaluations, you may be discriminated against. Some feel that, you know, you would be more advantaged, you know, to have an American accent. So some actually voluntarily seek out to change their accent. And so this Brazilian doctoral student of mine went in and was talking on the phone and saying, you know, I want to change my accent. And the person that answered had shared, no, you have a beautiful accent. You don't need to change it. You know, we're really looking for other kinds of accents, referring to East Asian accents. So it's not just language. But of course, coming with that is social isolation. Among the biggest challenges for internationals is not making friends, is loneliness, you know, the unfamiliarity of going to a new place, being away from friends and family, and so on. But even exacerbated if without being able to speak fluently in the host language. Cultural awareness, of course, right? Just knowing beyond just the words in the dictionary, but the assumptions, the slangs, the ways of greeting, the ways we interact, the way you talk to a professor, the way you engage in class, all of that, of course, also affects their experience. Resources and awareness. If those of you who've looked at universities in other countries, you know, the university has exploded in student affairs, but really you don't have the kinds of clubs, organizations, student support, housing, lifelong learning, living learning communities, and so on and so forth. And you know, of course, there's also the stigma for some groups to seek out counseling, and not even knowing that you can get counseling support. And a lot of my work has been looking at mistreatments, assaults, verbal assaults, sexual assaults, violence. That is also very much part of many international students' experience. I will say, though, when I did this, I started doing this work back in like 2005, 2006, and I was talking to international students just to better understand their stories. And these are just some of the many examples that they had shared. But I was surprised to learn that most had never told anyone. There are also fears of retaliation, especially against their professors. There's fears of being deported. If you don't have permanent residency and you're a temporary resident and you don't know the system, there's also this underlying fear like, well, I've invested so much in my studies. If I make the wrong move or piss off the wrong administrator, I don't want to lose my visa and be sent home. It's better just to stay silent. And so oftentimes we don't know of these stories because there's also, there may be some distrust, but more likely fear that there may be some retaliation based on what they say, and especially if they were to say something against a particular person who may have harmed them. So a lot of this stuff is still largely unknown. But in the work, I've noticed a consistent pattern in my decades of doing this, and that is that I'm not really talking about those from Canada or those from Australia or those from the UK. Consistently, there has been a clear pattern of difference between those from the global South and East Asia. I'm talking about those from the Middle East. I'm talking about those from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia. And part of that, of course, is related to their race. So I want to talk next about some of the frameworks. What is the lens? What are the glasses? What are the ways and the frames that you use to understand everything that's happening? So for example, if you are in enrollment management or an economist or in finance, you're thinking more about the net tuition gain of out-of-state students and the money that they use to support our operations. And that really is like the main focus of your concern. If you're in counseling, of course, you're thinking about the mental health of our students and ways that we can address that, right? And so I think these particular frames help us to understand the phenomena that we're viewing and what we decide to focus on. And so I'm going to introduce a few. Three in particular, the work I've probably been most cited for, but also to kind of shed light as we think about this population. So the first is neo-racism, and this is going beyond just assuming that all APIMED students are the same. This goes beyond the biological difference or the color of one's skin. We don't need to talk about racism. We all know what that is. But there's another layer of racism that differentiates someone like me with an American accent, with US citizenship, my mannerisms and my dress and my sense of humor, my ways of interacting that are very different, let's say, from a Korean international student with a different accent, with different ways of relating with others, with different assumptions about being here, right? And that is also the difference that I make when I talk about the difference between racism and neo-racism. So this framework started off, I actually uncovered it, it's decades old, from someone who was looking at what was happening in France. And there was Arab communities coming into France, and they were experiencing tremendous discrimination within the country. And the justification that was being used, that was why they were mistreated so poorly compared to those from neighboring European countries, like, well, those Arabs are threatening the French identity. And we see that rhetoric play out in the United States. Well, it's okay if we have visitors or even immigrants from Western Europe, from Canada, from these predominantly white countries, because they actually contribute to what it means to be American. You know, largely these European immigrants is what America's about. Oh, but those coming from south of the border, no, they're actually going to change what it means. Oh, they're speaking Spanish? That's changing. So it's this imaginary of what is America that is being threatened by these immigrants and is oftentimes used to say, well, that's why we're going to treat them like crap, is because they're actually a threat to our identity. So it's not just racism based on the color of one's skin, but stereotypes about the culture as perpetual foreigners, as dangerous, as a threat to the sense of a national identity, but also assumes the superiority of cultures, because earlier in the slide, again, I mentioned that there were those that were especially mistreated depending on the region that you were coming from. Again, it assumes that certain parts of the world are superior to others, certain immigrants are more welcome than others, is used to maintain the oppression, these hierarchies that we're still seeing. And in this globalizing world, we're not just talking about different social groups within the United States, but globally. Next, I'm turning to neo-nationalism. It's a little different. It's an extension of neo-racism, but now we're especially focusing on nationality. I had the opportunity to do some of this work in South Korea, in South Africa, in other parts of the African continent, and I found something I was a little disheartened that I didn't expect to see, and neo-racism didn't explain it. The group that was most mistreated in South Korea were actually the Chinese. The groups that were most mistreated in South Africa were the Nigerians and Zimbabweans. How do we explain this? So we're not just saying it's racism. There's also within race nationalism. And I think especially as we move forward and talk about this community, I think it's also important to acknowledge the tensions that may exist even within the same race, even within the Chinese population, the Japanese population, the Korean population, the Israeli population, that there are still tensions that have to do with national identity, so that we don't assume that they are all going to suddenly become friends and hang out, right? Underlying this is a sense of territoriality. Those of you who are familiar with this, the idea of settler colonialism, and part of that is assuming that land and identity are of the same and land is property. Not all cultures believe this. Indigenous populations didn't really believe this. Part of it explains why they were suddenly, or horribly, of course, colonized. But associating land with social identity, this is an assumption that I think needs to be challenged a bit more. So if I am born of a place, I am of that place. And I think a lot of cultures strongly ascribe to that. But what happens then if someone is not of that place and coming into your place? Is that place yours? Is that person a threat? Do they suddenly need to be killed or removed or forced out? And especially in a globalizing world, in Generation Z, there's more and more people who identify as global citizens. They don't see themselves as within one location. There's more mobility throughout the world. People who have lived and grown up and continue to travel across multiple countries and have more than one passport. And yet we still have borders. Of course, the one not too far from us as an example, that separates these groups, that assume there's an us and a them. And I think some of this is a little more uncomfortable to grapple with, because I think some of this is so embedded in our thinking that outside is scary, that strangers are dangerous, right? And I think some of this has just been ingrained in us as long as we've been, and even within our own universities, that this idea of borders is not questioned enough. But I think it's fundamental in understanding why our internationals are being discriminated against. And this view that borders is what separates us. And again, these are, and they may be federal borders, sometimes they may be state, but largely federal. And how does that then shape how we think of the other in ways that they are different, and in ways that they threaten us, in ways that they must be mistreated, in ways that they need to be put aside, in order to protect our own. And I think these are really difficult questions for us to grapple with, but when we talk about internationals, I think it's very difficult to avoid. So let me give you some stories. I don't know, just please, Dulce, wave if I start running out of time. So basically, when we talk about the IPMED population, and those of you who identify as such, we know that we are hyper-invisible and hyper-visible. Meaning that when it comes to DEI initiatives, we don't really count. We're not, many of us don't ascribe or associate ourselves as being black or brown. That we may be invisible because of a lot of stereotypes having to do with, well, we don't need the kind of help they do, right? And I'm not saying that that's true or not true. I'm saying that that is sometimes a rhetoric that is used to kind of invisibilize certain populations, especially those from the Middle East as well. And you'll see that there's not a lot of research compared to the API populations. So we're invisible in one sense, but we're also hyper-visible when it comes to some of the threats that we've just talked about earlier. So especially post 9/11, and depending on the international geopolitical conditions and who we're at war with, we've seen various assaults against Middle Eastern students, and not even Middle Eastern, but even South Asian. I know of a professor of Indian American, actually slit in the throat, waiting for a subway, and basically being blamed on the attacks for 9/11. I mean, how far removed can that be? But again, in the public's mind, there really is no difference. So when I say Middle Eastern, this includes students who may just appear as Middle Eastern, but are not. International postdocs, there's a lot of work. I think for the sake of time, I can't get into all of this, but there's also some trends that I've observed for a long time in ways that international postdocs are a form of cheap labor, even within our top universities, oftentimes exploited, oftentimes they don't have that career track towards tenure track positions. African student athletes, we love our college sports. It's not as, college sports is not a big thing abroad. We recruit international student athletes to help win titles and medals and prizes and so forth. But oftentimes, as a result, may not really be supported in their studies because we may be prioritizing winning those titles instead. Chinese scientists still under investigation. Again, the Department of Justice has not demonstrated there's clear systematic espionage that's happening from China, and yet, nevertheless, they still are being investigated. Many organizations, and I would agree, well, what do we do? All of this is so depressing. I need a drink. It's not even, I don't even think it's noon yet. Education, of course. I mean, that's the amazing thing about working in a university, is this is actually something we can do. This is our responsibility to educate. So, of course, where do we go from here? The curriculum, right? For those of you who are involved in the curriculum and general education, you know that in interdisciplinary education is so important. In what ways are ISPO stories, histories, culture, awareness brought into the general education curriculum? Of course, Asian American studies programs, but not even those hyphenated American programs, but even area studies, which oftentimes tend to be separate. We have our East Asian programs that may be very different from the Asian American studies programs. And again, in what ways can we come together? Of course, educating the community on dismantling stereotypes. And I think it's really important when university leaders point out the achievements, because oftentimes what we see in the press is ways that they have been attacked or are attacking and fueling the public perceptions of these populations. How can we challenge that? By celebrating their accomplishments. Of course, calling it out. Small groups, large groups, you all know what that is. How do we dialogue across difference? For example, international students tend not to go to cultural centers. They see it as for the Americans of that culture. How do we encourage their engagement? How do we work with international student services along with our DEI initiatives? How do we incorporate that and dialogue across difference? Not just across different races, but especially within the same race for those immigrants as well as domestic students that identify from that same ethnicity. And campus racial climate that I'll talk about at the end. I think oftentimes when we think about, where do we go from here? I know the first thing is we need more money. Let's ask the provost or the president, the chancellor for money. And oftentimes that's the go-to. We need to increase the numbers. We need to increase our programs. We need more. I agree. I think that's vitally important. But I think it's also important that we not stop there, because sometimes that may pit us against other communities of color and really may not get to the heart of these issues. Oftentimes, we don't need to include Asian Americans because there's already so many. They're doing great, right? But oftentimes what is not said is that AAPI students experience more microaggressions than any other community of color. They experience more racial harassment and have less positive cross-cultural experiences. And so when we just look at enrollment counts, oftentimes that's the marker of having a really diverse campus and we're doing really great. And then since there's so many of this group, let's not pay attention. Let's focus on this other group where we have too few. And again, the limitation of that is that we don't look at those experiences because then we assume they're all doing fine because they're here and they graduate. But what about their experience in the classroom, in their interactions, and what happens, of course, even outside their own campus? And also within faculty, we may have a lot of Asian sciences within STEM fields, but what's the composition in the leadership? What's the composition among deans, among the upper, most senior levels? What does the representation there look like, especially when AAPI faculty have the lowest probability of getting tenured and leadership positions compared to other groups? Unfortunately, I don't have the numbers for Middle Eastern. Again, the problem is that this is a population that is oftentimes ignored or swept as part of another group, and I think it's all the more important that we continue to identify, embrace, and integrate ways that we can think about Middle Eastern populations as well. All of this, though, that I pointed to earlier about why when we just focus on the numbers is also fueled by this model minority myth. That earlier story I gave you earlier, yay, we made it to Disneyland, their daughter got a university degree, she got a PhD, but what about the actual experiences? Do we have to assume that's what it takes, that that is just what it is, and that we all must somehow be resilient and suffer through and make it through? How can we go back and challenge some of this? So I'll go into that in a bit. And again, as I said earlier in the beginning, I think your own stories are so important, and I hope you have the opportunity to reflect upon them. I really do believe that is the way towards advocacy, towards coalition building, to motivating good work. But even reflecting upon, for a moment, on just anything I've shared up to this point on, what is your experience? What have you observed on campus? This may even be within your own childhood, amongst your family, among friends, among those you've worked with. What has been my action? How have I remained silent? How have I been complicit? How have I done anything to change the situation, right? And I think it's really important because I would hate for us to talk about all these things and we leave when we just carry on with business as usual. And what are the assumptions? Why? I think for a long part of my childhood and even part of my adulthood, I was fed this narrative, well, that's just the way it is. It's just hard because we're immigrants here. And we need to somehow just work it through. We need to make it happen. We need to hustle and find a way. And I still think that's how many immigrants and first-generation students perceive what it means to be successful, is that it is what it is, so we just need to bear with it, right? But I want to take this further, and given the opportunity, what are the institutional structures and conditions that perpetuate these problems? Because I think it's easy for us to go into lunch with a guilt trip thinking, oh, I could do more, I don't do enough. And yeah, we can each do more. But I think there's more that we can do as a collective, and thinking as well about our own structures, the conditions, and to a larger extent, some of the policies and norms that make these challenges so difficult. Because it's one thing to kind of work with that international student, say, hey, you can do it. Let me show you these tutoring programs. Here's a Best Buddy program. This is how you can go on to graduate school and so on. We can all spend a lot of time doing that, but there's also something about changing the curriculum, changing the structures and conditions. How do we work across offices? How do we then provide the conditions where we don't have to go to each one student at a time, but really help to promote much of what we hope to see with, when we talk about internationalization. Sylvia Hurtado and her colleagues provide one way to go beyond compositional diversity. And what I said earlier, compositional diversity refers to just more money, more resources, more people. There's more we can do, and sometimes it doesn't have to cost multi-million dollars. But really thinking strategically about our campus climates. And there's multiple dimensions of this, and then I'll apply it to our own population, and I'll be wrapping up with that. But historically, right? The historical exclusion and ways that our mission incorporates these populations, particularly our international populations, many who are still feeling invisibilized when it comes to these efforts. What does our structure look like? What is the process for tenure, hiring, budgeting, the curriculum? What is it privilege? How does it support some groups over other groups? Of course, composition still matters, and I think especially when it comes to our Middle Eastern populations, what is the representation on campus in relation to staff and faculty ratios? What are the kind of interactions that are taking place? What is it like for an international with a domestic? What is it like within the ISPO community? What is it like within the same ethnicity? What do those interactions look like? And of course, we didn't talk enough about mental health, but it's a huge issue among internationals. I mean, who wouldn't, going to another country, feeling mistreated, stereotyped, feeling silenced, and not having a place to go or who to talk to. So again, the psychological, of course, is a really important dimension as well. So Jane Pizzolatto and I were writing a piece for Change magazine and thinking about what does this mean for our international ISPO-Med students. How has this group historically been included or excluded in mission statements and practices? There are some DEI initiatives that are very specific and purposely or not, do not include ISPO-Med students. And I think that's also important to recognize. How are they recognized? How are they included? What are the activities associated? And organizationally, we're all kind of in a time where we're fighting for resources. What groups are being privileged? How is that reflected in staffing? What kind of resources are being set aside? What does that look like in terms of a budget, in terms of the organizational chart, in terms of reporting lines? How is it structured in certain ways that may advantage some groups over others? Of course, the composition, student ratios, and also among internationals. What are the kinds of interactions that are taking place upon our ISPO-Med, sorry, I put A at the end, ISPO-Med with those internationals versus our domestics, I think is underexplored and important to recognize. And what are their perceptions on campus? And so I'll leave you with this. I think this is enough discussion for the next day, couple days, if not the rest of the year, and thinking more about the climate for our internationals and going beyond just adding more, helping that one person, and thinking more about the broader structures and really questioning these narratives about what it means to be as successful. Are we celebrating them because they were able to overcome all the horrible barriers that we put up? Or can we eliminate some of those barriers and provide ways for them to really feel included, be successful, and to recognize their stories, and to find ways that they may connect with our own stories, whether or not we identify with that particular nationality. And the last point is, of course, with faculty and staff. A lot of this conversation is about our students. We care about our students. We're here to serve our students. But it's also important that we take care of ourselves, for our own staff in ways our own ISPO-Med staff being supported, being recognized, are being celebrated. For our faculty, what are some ways that they can be further promoted up into the senior ranks to really be in positions to make some change. So thank you all. I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for listening. We have 5 minutes, so I'm happy to entertain any questions before I send you off.
If anyone has questions, I'll come to you.
Of course, the furthest from the side.
I'm like jingling everywhere.
Here's me making Andrew run from end to end. I'm curious, thank you so much for your session. I'm curious in terms of, at the University of Arizona, what are some initiatives or best practices that you perhaps have been able to implement that you would like to share that we could learn from here at UC San Diego?
Yeah, I think that's really important. There's been a lot of conscious efforts to really work along, I mentioned earlier, international student services and the cultural centers. At my university, they're very divided. There's very limited interaction. So there's more steps to have more of this programming and bringing these together. Among the biggest challenges for those who work in these centers and student affairs is the rift between internationals and domestics. So the typical international comes to the university thinking, I really want to make friends with an American student. Sometimes the interest is not coming, even and assuming, if one is of the same race, that would happen. So I'll say I'll confess, growing up in San Diego, especially in Poway, it was predominantly white, and I would see a Korean international. I remember as a teenager thinking, oh, I don't want to hang out with them. They're just so weird, and I would just hang out with my white friends, right? Like there was part of me that I felt some shame. And I think part of that is being in a predominantly white place, feeling like that othering is not good, right? And I think that still carries on during the college years. So yeah, we can force them in a room and they probably still won't party, but I think things are changing. I think I have a lot of optimism about Generation Z and the ways that they are really valuing this interconnectedness. So I think that the most important thing that we've been trying to work on is to ways that we can engage the domestics with the internationals. I mentioned earlier celebrating the positive achievements of our APIMED faculty and students is going out of one's way to recognize the positive and kind of challenge some of those stereotypes is another. There's also been, I didn't talk enough about the China initiative, but there also have been some close conversations with Chinese scientists and reminding them that they're being valued, that they will be supported should the FBI investigate, that the university has their back. To have those conversations, I think, has really been assuring for the scientific community, the Chinese scientific community in our own university. I've been interviewing many across the United States. It's a big issue. It's not talked about enough, and I think hearing from the senior leadership in ways that they are valued and supported, that they will have their backs, has been really helpful.
Thank you very much. Other questions? And Carly has a mic on the other side, so I don't have to run.
Hi. I would like to know, how can, international students help each other out? Because, when I got to here, I was, kind of, going around different clubs and, figured out how to, fit into UCSD. So, but in what way can international students help each other out?
Yeah, I think internationals have been such a tremendous resource to one another. There's some research that has shown that internationals are more likely to hang out with one another than they are with domestic students. Even international students from warring countries are more likely to be friends than they are with a student from the United States. There are many international communities that have this shared experience of just being an international. And so the benefit is that that shared experience will naturally lead to these really close and lifelong friendships. The problem, though, is sometimes when international student groups are so isolated that there may be misinformation, that it's not being checked, or that stereotypes or fears may be perpetuated. And I think that's all the more important for them to have the opportunity to engage with locals, students, and leaders. I do find they're already helping each other out. I think, if anything, what more can be done, I think, is some moral support, and knowing their experience is not alone. International students, sometimes from places of the world, they've never been to San Diego. Their first time in the United States is when they land to start classes. There may not be anyone to meet them at the airport, or they come and they don't know anybody, and they don't even know where to get things, right? How to get from here to there. And so internationals have been tremendously helpful, especially with my own students who are coming in. That visa process has just been, I'm sure many of you can relate. And having another international student to provide those tips in ways that I think many domestics don't understand or can sympathize or support. So I think, especially when it comes to immigration procedures, rules change all the time, visiting home. International Student Services have that information, but I think in many ways the moral support coming from other internationals, I know, has been really important for our students. Thanks for the question.
I think we have time for one more if someone has one.
Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. I'm curious about the use of APIMED versus APIMEDA, and just wondering about dropping the A.
That was my mistake. That's a typo,
okay.
Not intentional. So yeah, apologies for that.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Thank you.
I think that's it.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, and please give a round of applause to Dr. Jenny Lee. Awesome. Well, again, I do want to thank Dr. Jenny Lee for her expertise, research, knowledge that she has shared with us today. It is now probably the best time of the day for everyone, and I don't want to keep you from it, which is lunch. We're excited that we get to have a wonderful speaker with us today, Dr. Christina Yao, to speak with us during lunchtime. So I wanted to let folks know the lunch has been provided with the many help of housing, dining, and hospitality services. Thank you to Annie Lynn and also Carly Labrador for coordinating the lunch for today. I'm going to pull up the list really quick on what's being served for all of you. What we do ask for folks is that you'll enter through that large entryway where you came in from check-in, and then you basically turn right. You'll be directed to grab the lunches that are being offered, and you'll come in through the smaller exit way over here and back to wherever you would like to sit. We have many tables, so if you feel more comfortable being more spread out while you have lunch, please feel free to do so. For today, what we are having is HGH has brought to you some gourmet sandwiches of ham, vegetarian, turkey, chicken, and Italian. And then for those who are that share their dietary restrictions, please feel free to look out for Carly, which I believe is right in the back. Oh, they'll find you. Carly was the other individual who was running with the mic on this side. So with that being said, if you don't mind, go ahead and you can start getting up, grabbing your lunch, and come right back in. Thank you, everyone.